So in this lecture, we are going to kind of look at the basics of island biogeography. And the reason is that we're going to apply some of these principles to habitat loss and fragmentation in the next lecture. So following this lecture, you should be able to define island biogeography and understand rates of colonization and extinction in an island habitat. So first, I want to ask you a question. You go into a forest, you measure all the species that you could find in 1 square meter, in a 1 meter squared area. And then you measure all the species you could find in a separate 10 meter square area. Which plot would have more species and why? Not a trick question. If you said the larger area, that's correct. And the reason is because there's more space. And you can even see here in terms of how many trees. There's different types of trees. Here we have this one with just a few, maybe 1 or 2. And then here we have many different trees in this larger area. So some species might need that larger amount of space. You might be more likely to find them here than in the small plot. So you might be more likely to find them in the large plot than in the small plot where they might be moving through really quickly. So this same principle applies to islands if you think of these plots as little islands. And eventually, like I said, talking about fragments of habitat that are left, you would think of these as not connected. So the principle we're going to discuss is what's called island biogeography. And that is a field that's, of study that examines the factors that affect species richness, which is how many species there are, and the diversification of isolated natural communities. So if you have isolated communities on an island, how does the number of species and the diversity of those species, how is it different between islands? So there is a correlation that we see with islands. So here, for example, so on the y-axis we have the number of species, so going from 1 to 1,000. On the x-axis we have island size in square kilometers. So it's going from a very small island, 1 square kilometer, to very large island, 1 million square kilometers. So in other words, small islands are going to be on the left part of the plot, larger islands will be on the right side. And so here we have Redonda is a tiny little island in the Caribbean, and Cuba, all the way up to Cuba, which is off the coast of Florida. And so what we see here is that smaller islands have smaller number of species, and then this is going to go up. So larger islands have larger number of species. And I did get a picture of these islands. It's a little hard to compare because Redonda is such a small island compared to Cuba. But this is the entire island of Redonda, and you can just kind of look at that and see that there's, it doesn't look like the vegetation has all that much diversity. And if there's not much diversity in vegetation, then there's probably not all that much diversity in animal life. So in contrast, here is the island of Cuba, and you can see mountains, you can see fields. This is possibly like agriculture. This is definitely a city, but you know, you can imagine that there's probably a wide variety. This is one small part of the island, so there's probably quite a bit more variety in vegetation, and we'd assume that there's a wider number of species that could live in that area. So I'd like you to know some hypotheses of island biogeography so that we can later apply it to habitat fragmentation. And so the first is what's called the distance effect. And so this is looking at colonization of islands near the mainland. So basically, how many species are going to move from the mainland to an island and colonize it, start living there? And so, not surprisingly, what we find is that the closer you are to the mainland, the more species are going to colonize that mainland, that island. It's closer for them to get to. It's more likely that they'll find it. And so you see here that we've got representatives of 3 species going from the mainland to the island. And then when it's farther away, there's only 1. So what we find is that there's fewer. The diversity of species is less as you get as islands get farther away from the mainland. What we find is called target size. So we're going to have more species colonize larger islands. And that goes back to that question when we're looking at the forest, which plot is bigger or would have more species. And so more land, there's going to be more species. So it'll be also likely, if there's more land, it's also likely to have more resources. And so that can support more species. It'll have more trees, more water available, more food, more shelter. So it can support more species colonizing it than a smaller island that doesn't have as many resources. So now you might be saying, wait a minute, this island's larger, but it's farther away. So on an exam, I would never give you a question like that. We'll focus on the main concept. So you'll either be looking at large, close islands, which will have similar effects, or small, far islands, which would have similar effects. So I'm not going to mix things up and give you a large, far island like here. Just want you to understand the basic concept. So the last aspect with island biogeography is extinction. And so in this third picture. And so what we find is that proportionally fewer species go extinct on larger islands. So here it's 1/3, 2/6, which reduces to 1/3 of the species going extinct. And then on the smaller island, we have 2 out of 3, 2/3 going extinct. So a smaller proportion of species go extinct on larger islands. Again, there's going to be more resources usually available on larger islands, so it can support a larger population, a larger number of different species, as well as the populations themselves. Now, when we look at extinction rates, there still might be a larger number of species going extinct than on a small island because there's more species. And we talked about background extinction, but we want to look at percents, okay, at rates, which has to do with the percentage or proportion of species that are going extinct. So just to look at that in another sort of way, don't get too freaked out by this diagram. Again, species richness is the number of species, and that's on the x-axis. So there's a higher number of species on the right than on the left. And what we're going to be looking at is these intersection points, okay? So you'll see that if you're on a far small island, which is this intersection point here between the far and small lines, that there's a less species richness than if we were on a near large island, which is the intersection here of the near and large lines. This has greater species richness than the far small. So that's what I want you to understand on a test. So again, we want to apply these concepts to fragmented lands. It doesn't just have to be islands and water. And we'll talk more about habitat fragmentation, but just to get you thinking about it, you see here is forests with agricultural land in between. And so there's some species that are only going to be able to live in the forested areas. So in a sense, they're now on an island of a forest because they might not be able or willing to travel across the open land to get to another forested area. Maybe they fear predation. Maybe it's an organism that just lives in treetops and it can't get across. So we could apply this concept to a lot of different areas. Even this, do you know what this is? This is Central Park in New York City. So it acts like an island. There's much higher species richness here than there is in the city part. You can sometimes even find coyotes in Central Park. We can also find reverse islands, where in this area, these prairie potholes actually have the greater density of species, greater diversity. Each of these little pond potholes. And then here in this agricultural land, so agricultural land might be the less desirable habitat, but it might be more desirable than just the soil. So you might find some greater diversity in the grown areas. So the idea is islands, even though we typically think of them as land and water, when we think of them ecologically, islands are isolated quality habitat, an area where species can live and they get kind of stuck in that area. So now that you've listened to this lecture, you should be able to define island biogeography and understand rates, colonization, and extinction.